Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending our presentation this morning. So I'm going to be talking today about test data, which I think is a subject that most of us know something about, but I think today you're going to probably, even if you've been using AscentialTest for a long time, you might learn some things that you just didn't know were possible. So I'm going to give you a lot of different options today on how you can manage your test data. I'll talk a little bit about test data tables with step data parameters, which is really the normal way that we use, I should say the most common way that we use AscentialTest. I'm also going to talk a little bit about project data. I'll talk about plan and suite data, and there may be some surprises here for some people who have never experimented with that. I'll talk about test data parameters and step data tables. This is something that a lot of people don't do, is where they actually integrate their steps with a data table. Most of us integrate our tests with a data table, but I want to show you how you can do that as well. I'll also talk about using key fields to encapsulate test data. I'm going to talk very briefly about metadata for expected results. I've actually covered this before in a seminar on our table interface, but since it does interface with test data, I want to briefly mention that. I'll talk about passing data, parameters in, out, and shared, and then I'll talk about data persistence between tests. I've actually been getting a lot of questions about this lately, so we're going to talk about that. And we'll talk about adding dynamic prefixes or suffixes to test data strings in order to make them unique. So let's talk first about test data tables. And again, this is the most common way that I think most of us think about managing test data. If you've worked with me in a POC or just learning how to use AscentialTest, this is probably the way I've taught you how to manage your test data. So let's just look at an example of that, which will probably be review for most people. So let's take a look at this, excuse me, purchase orders test plan, and you'll see that I have a test plan here in front of us, and I've got a test hooked up to this section of my data table. If I double click on the T, we know that we can go right in and look at the steps. And so I've got a number of steps, and if I double click on one of the steps, we see that the step has been parameterized. I guess this step's a little unusual because it calls other steps, but that's probably not a surprise to anyone. And so we've parameterized the step by using, the data button and saying add parameters. So this is the most common way, I would say, of using AscentialTest. And so when we do that, when we parameterize the steps and we look back again at the test, then we go to the data button again and we say bind data table. And what AscentialTest does is it generates the data table for us, gives us this row ID so that we can index the table, and then it associates all of the step parameters with a column in the data table. So sales rep, cust ID, item list. If we go to the table, we're going to see sales rep, cust ID, item list. So again, that's really pretty much a review because that's the normal way or the most common way that I think we use data tables and how we manage our test data. Now let's talk a little bit about project data. Now, project data is the best place to store data that is universal to the entire project. Now, that means that when I say universal to the entire project, that means that we're going to set a value for this particular test run, and we're not expecting to change that. I've gotten a lot of questions lately about, well, can you modify the project data at runtime? Well, that's not really what it was intended to do. And we'll talk about ways of sort of having dynamic data a little bit later in this presentation. So project data is really meant a place to store some data that's going to be universal to the project, at least for the current run. And the way that we access that data is through the data store.query. And in this case, I've got a little piece of data called data source. So let's take a look at that. So if I go up to my project data, we see sure enough I have this data item called data source, and it's set to my database. Now if I look at, I have an app state that uses that. Come here, you'll see that at runtime I'm querying the data store for data source. And again, just to remind you, here we go. Here it is, data source. So at runtime, I'm having to set a value to a drop down, and I'm getting that from my project data. So if I wanted to change that before I was going to execute, maybe I've got different databases that I want to run against, and today I want to run against this particular data source, I would go to project data and set it. Now, I have heard from folks, I didn't actually provide an example of this, but I have heard from folks that have said, well, what if I forget to change the project data? Well, one technique I've explained to folks that they can do is you can always put a manual step in your project so that when you run your first test, maybe you pop up a manual dialog box that says, did you remember to set your project data? And then if you didn't, you could always cancel the run and go do it, or you could just simply click OK, and then the rest of the run will go through. Well, don't put it in your OnStart because you don't want that to pop up for every single test case because you're probably not going to be sitting in front of the machine. Okay, now I want to talk about something that's related to project data, and that's plan data or suite data. And here there might be some surprises for folks that haven't explored this. Now, this is the best place to store data that's universal to the current plan, not to the whole project, but to the current plan or instance of the plan in a suite. And you'll find that it actually overrides project data. We access the data the exact same way, data store.query, just like we did for project data. So we access it the same way, and in that case, we were looking at browser type. So let's take a peek at this. So I'm going to go to my plan, which is my browser example. And if I go up to plan data, you'll see that I have browser type. And in this case, I've set the default to Firefox. Now, if we look back at project data, we'll see that I actually had the browser type there, and I set that to Internet Explorer. But because I set the value in plan data to Firefox, if I were to run this plan right now, it would use Firefox, not Internet Explorer, because I've overridden it. Now, if I look at the suite, I have a suite called Cross-Browser Tests. You'll see that in my suite, I've called that plan that I just showed you 3 times. I've dragged over that 3 times. And in each case, I don't know if you know you can do this, you can edit the instance name. I've actually put the instance name in here, and that's why you see it in parentheses. So it's the same plan, browser example, but this instance, I've named it Internet Explorer. Now, by naming it doesn't change the data, of course. It's just the name of the instance. But watch this. So if I come down here, I've set it, my plan data in the suite, there's a tab for plan data. That's this same plan data that we were looking at up here. It's grayed out now because I'm in a suite, not in a plan. Here is where I can override it here. So for this instance or occurrence of the plan, I've set it to Internet Explorer. Here, I've set it to Chrome. And here, I've set it to Firefox. And so if I were to run this, it's not going to do anything visual. You'll see when I look at my output. I basically just printed it so that you can see. And finally, here. Now here I'm only printing it, but of course if you were doing this for real, you'd be doing a set browser, and that would allow you to run, in this case, the exact same plan across the different browsers. Okay, let's now talk about test data parameters. Most commonly used for the row ID that's generated with bind data table, but that's not the only way to use it. We can actually use this instead of data tables. And it does have the advantage of data reuse. So there's some pros to using data tables versus data parameters, and some cons. So there's some pros and cons, and I'll talk about that as I show you the example. So let's look at my purchase orders plan again. And I'm going to click on the second test here. And I want to show you how different this looks. So in this case, you'll notice that instead of binding this test to a data table, I used parameters instead. So instead of highlighting my steps and going to the button here and saying bind data table, what I did instead was I highlighted everything and I came to the data button and I said add parameters instead, which is something that we more typically do with a step, but I did it with a test. So you'll notice that it looks a lot like the way a step looks, in that you see, instead of just the row ID, you actually see the parameters listed here. Now I'm also doing some parameter passing here, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But what I want you to concentrate right now is this right here. So if I go back and look at the plan, you see that instead of having just the row ID, we've got the actual data right in the plan. And here's what I was talking about when I said it has the advantage of reuse. Watch this. Notice I set all the data at the parent node, where I've got this group of tests that I call positive tests with data in plan. Now if I come here and click on this instance, you're going to notice a slightly different coloring. If you see it in bright blue, it means that I'm inheriting the data from the parent. You see I put in Mark Dill 106 and I didn't put anything in the item list. Whereas here, you see this is in blue. I did not put it in, I inherited it, but I did overwrite the customer ID and I provided the parent list. Now if I come here, you see I've overridden everything. And you can tell because it's in black type instead of blue. And here I've inherited the sales rep and the cust ID, and I only provided the item list. So that's a different way of managing the test data. It's more like the way that we use a plan, but I've done it in the test instead. Now I want to talk about something a little bit different. I want to talk about binding steps instead of tests to data tables. This is something maybe you haven't tried before. One of the advantages, I guess, is that it allows you to reuse your test data. So you're not tying your test data to a particular test instance. You're able to reuse it. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to show you another plan. And I'm going to double click on this test here. And you'll notice I have two tests. And in this case, I don't have one row ID, I have two row IDs, and here's why. Because what I did was, instead of creating parameters, using add parameters for my step, remember I'm in a step now, not in a test. So instead of using the most common add parameters, I directly bound this step to a data table. And you can see that. It's got a data store query, and it gives me a row ID. So it looks kind of like a test in that regard. Now, there are two ways of doing this. And I left this field here. I left this one blank just so I could show you. If I come here and say bind data tables, you'll notice that when you're going to be binding a step to a data table, you actually have a choice. You could use a local query, or you could use a shared record parameter, and I'm going to show you the difference. In this particular case, I used a local query. And so when I use a local query, I get a row ID as an input parameter. It's not a shared parameter, it's an input parameter. And so you see the row ID here. So if this looks familiar to you, it's because this looks a lot like when we bind a test to a data table. And if we go back and look at the test again in the plan, well, here's the test. You see the row ID from the step came into here. And I've done the same thing with this one. So this is exactly done the same way. So I've got two steps, and each of them contains, so each step is bound to a data table. Now, you could have row ID as one parameter. In other words, I could have just had row ID, but I decided in this case I wanted to have two separate parameters, row ID and row ID2. So if we come here to the plan, you see I have row ID and row ID2. Now I happen to set them to the same value, but I wanted the flexibility of being able to vary them. So I created separate ones. Okay, now I'm going to show you something similar, but a little bit different. Here, if I click on the test, you're going to notice something a little bit different. You'll notice that these steps don't have a parameter. They don't have the row ID. And the reason is because if I go into this one, you'll notice in this case, when I bound it to a data table, come here to bind data table, I select shared record parameter, not local query. It's different. Instead, what it did is it created a shared parameter, which was the variable of type record, the type record for the row of the data table. This one's a little bit tricky when you look at it. You don't quite understand it as readily, I think, as the other one. So here you see the add an employee shared parameter record dot, and then of course this is the column in the table. So it looks a little strange, I think. And again, when we come back here and look at the test, we see the shared record. And in this case, I've got the row ID set to the same. I could vary it if I want to, but I think the spirit of shared is that they're going to be the same. And notice no parameters here. You don't have to pass in the row ID because that's taken care of by the shared parameters. They're being set here, and since they're shared, so we pass in the row ID, and since it's shared, if we look back at the steps, we'll see it's a shared parameter. It gets the value from the shared parameter. You do not need to pass it. That's the primary difference there. Now I'm going to show you something kind of related, but a little different. Excuse me, my mic fell. You're probably hearing a little static. There we go. Here, I'm going to use a key field to encapsulate test data. So this would be data that is used maybe in many steps or tests. So if that's true, if you're going to use data in many steps or tests, it's best to put it in its own table and then use a key field to look up the data. So let me explain that one now. So I want to show you a table that I created called test credit cards. Now this is kind of common in retail especially, where you've maybe got a whole bunch of test credit cards that you're using. And so this is my key field here, and you'll notice that since it's a key field, I put a constraint on it. I said it's got to be unique. And so I call this my test Visa, my test MasterCard, and my test Discover. So that's my key field. And then I have all the data that goes with it. So the card number, the type, the expiration date, and the little secret code. So that's my data. Now let's look in customer. So now I've got this table called customer data, and I've got all the different variables or parameters for my customer, but I don't put the customer's credit card data in the table. Instead, I just put the value of the key field that I want to look up in this table. So here I'll say, well, I want to use my test Visa card. For this record, I want to use my test MasterCard, and in this one, my test Discover. And then again, to go get the actual data, I look it up. So let's take a look at an example now. So I have a test that's going to use that. Let's come over here, and I can sort these alphabetically so I can find them. Yep. And here we are. So here I'm querying against the customer data table. So remember that was this one here. Querying against that table. And here's where my row ID comes in. So this is the test case that I'm running. I want this row ID from the data table that has most of my test data in it. But my credit card data is not actually in that table. So instead, what I do is I get the credit card ID out of my customer table, and then I do another query against the test cards in order to get the actual data. And so I've run it already, so I don't have to run it to you again. You can see that here I've got a couple print statements. I'm printing some of the data from customer. So you can see I'm printing the first name of my TC01 record, and then I'm printing the actual credit card, which doesn't come from my customer table. It comes from this table instead. And there's the value, the credit card number. So this approach has the advantage of being able to use this data over and over again in many test cases. So that's why you would do that. Okay, now let's take a look at my metadata example. Now this might be review for some folks if you've been to other tech seminars, because I did talk about this once before when we did our table interface. I discussed this. So this is where we can store the expected results data within the step, and that's if it's static, if it's not going to change. So let's take a look at that. So I've got a test called, or step called verify table contents. Let me find that for you. And so here, you notice I have this verify. And here's my data object right here. So I've got select customer, and I've got my customers table. So this happens to be a data window, a Power Builder, but it doesn't have to be. It could be any table, .NET, it could be web, doesn't matter, any table. And if we look here, this is very important. If you want to use this, you have to set your metadata in order to do that. You've got to come into your metadata editor and you've got to check the row. You've got to check the row in order to get the row of, this basically creates a record at runtime is what it does, to store the values. If we click on this, you notice that it actually, again, it's static. It is the data that's in the data table, my expected results. So this was captured from the snapshot. So again, it's got to be static. Can't be data that you would prefer to pass in. You wouldn't be able to use that. This is useful when you're not changing your test data, but the application is changing, and you want to make sure that every single time you run this test over time that you get the exact same result. It's actually quite a convenient and easy way to do that, because this little icon here basically stores your baseline. And so every time you run the test against a new version of the application, with the data state being the same, it's always going to verify that. Some people use this for reports. So they're generating reports and they're getting the data out of their table, which is representing their reports, and they're just comparing it from build to build, run to run, that they always get the same exact result. Very easy, because in order to do it, all you do is you just click the append button here. That's it. So here we are. We've got the customers table, and you could either drag the table or click the append button, but you don't have to do anything at all in order to deal with your test data. It grabs it right out of the snapshot. So again, very quick, easy way to develop expected results in a table form if the data is always going to stay the same from run to run, build to build. Now I want to talk about passing data parameters. This might be review for some people. So there are three different modes of test parameters. There's in, there's out, and there's shared. And we talked a little bit about shared a minute ago when we were looking at the way we bound those data tables to the steps. So let's take a quick look at that. So I've got a test for you here, and it's called my database query. And so you'll notice that I've got a couple of steps in this test, my database query example. My first step actually does a database query. So I'm connecting to a database and I'm grabbing the customer ID. And you'll notice that I have an output parameter, custom ID. Now I always remind people of this because I make the mistake every once in a while. And that is, if you have an output parameter, in this case called customer ID, don't create another parameter inside called customer ID, because if you do and you assign the value to that customer ID, it's not this one. The one inside your step is going to override this customer ID, and essentially there will be no way for you to pass a value to it. So if you want an output parameter, it comes in and then you assign it. You do not create the variable inside of the step. And so I've done it correctly here. You'll notice I'm not declaring a variable of integer, type integer, called customer ID. I'm correctly using the one that I'm passing in, but I am assigning it. I'm fetching from my database query, I'm fetching it into the customer ID, then I'm simply printing it and passing it out. And we'll see how it gets then passed from the output parameter of my first step just by dragging it. I just put my mouse on here and dragged and dropped into the input step of the input parameter of my second step. So this step is producing the customer ID, and this step is consuming the customer ID. And that's how we do that. Now let's look at shared. That's a little bit different. So I've got some steps for you here. I have a first step and second step. And so I've got a record. In fact, this is my credit card data, the same record that we were looking at before. I've got a record, credit card data. And in this step, I'm assigning values to an instance or a variable of type credit card data. So I've got my test Visa card 1, and I'm setting values to it. Then in my second step, I'm printing the values. So that's all I'm doing there is I'm printing. Now if we look at the test, you see I call these two steps. So first I call first step, which sets all the values. And then I call the second step, which prints all the values. And if I run it for you, you'll see that sure enough, the values that were set in the first step get printed in the second step. Oops, that's because I ran a test and didn't actually do anything to a GUI, so my UA server popped up. Now let's talk a little bit about data persistence, and this topic comes up a lot lately for some reason. Folks want to have persistence between tests, and you know in AscentialTest there is no buffer, runtime buffer between tests. Every single test is its own unit, and so when you have multiple tests in a plan, there isn't any way, at least currently, that you could pass data from one test to another. In fact, it sort of breaks what I consider a golden rule, is that each test should be independent of other tests. But I know in practice sometimes it's not really practical. So people do have tests that are dependent upon one another, and they run in order. Sometime in the future, we may address that. It's been something we've thought about for a very long time, maybe having return codes from each test so that a test that does depend on another test will know the return code of a previous test so that it could decide whether or not to run. I've actually helped customers implement that manually because I needed to do that myself quite a long time ago. So there is a way to do that. And if you ever need to do that, just contact support and we can help you do it. But there isn't a way to do it easily in AscentialTest right now. So instead, if we want persistence between tests, we need to figure out some place where we can write the data so that it could then be read by subsequent tests. My favorite way to do that is through an INI file, and I'm going to show you an example of that. But, you know, you can also use an ASCII file. You can use a comma-separated file. You can use an XML file. We now support JSON files, so I suppose you could do that too. And by the way, those of you who just heard me say XML files might be saying, what? You didn't know that. Well, there is a library that we currently have. It's outside of AscentialTest, but it's written in Z that does allow you to read, write, parse XML files. It hasn't ever been built into AscentialTest, and it hasn't been documented, but it is available. Now, after this current release, 9.7, which is almost done, we will be pulling the XML into AscentialTest and documenting it to make it easier. But I want you to know that you can still do it today, which means that you could actually make a SOAP call. You don't really have to wait for us to do that. But again, we will be building that in pretty soon. The other way is to use a database, and I've had several customers do that. They read and write to databases so that one test could write values to a database and then a subsequent test could read those values from a database. Now, I kind of think of an INI file as a really little low-tech database, and I will talk a little bit about that now. So I've got a function here, and maybe some of you are looking at this saying, oh, I didn't know I could write a function. Well, you can, and it's supported here under functions. If you create a function in AscentialTest, and you can do that by just saying add function, you can create your own function. And so I've created a function called getNextSequence. And what getNextSequence does is it reads, let me just make a little bit more room here. And I'll bring up my INI file for you too, so you can see what my INI file looks like. I always create a, I should back up here. If I'm going to be doing this, I always create another folder in my project called data, and that's where I store my INI file. So I just want to bring that up for you so you can see it. It's pretty simple, right? It's just one section and one data item, but it will help me explain how this all works. So in my function, I'm returning a string, and so there's my return type up there. And I've got a string called index to return, and I'm declaring, I've got my handle to my INI file, and here's my open. And by the way, if you've not used the INI interface before, it's really easy to use. You just come over to classes INI, and in this case I wanted to open, so you just drag over the open. That's all you have to do. And when you drag over the open, it automatically creates the handle for you and puts this statement in here. And then all you have to do is put in the name of your INI file. Whoops, hang on one sec, this went behind. So let me, because I clicked, let me bring it back up. Here we go. I'll put it here now so that if I lose it again, I can simply click on it. So here's my sequence.ini file. And I want to get the value of, and the way that this works is this is the section, and this is what I call the L value, or the left value. So sequence is the section, and in an INI file, the section is always in square brackets. So I have my section sequence, and then I have my L value, which is called indents. Now, if I wanted to, I can have more, I can have another section, just so you see how this works. So you can have other sections in your INI file, but I'm concerned with this section right here called sequence. So here's my sequence, here's my index, and this is getting the R value, the right side value, right of the equal sign, it's getting it. Okay, now I'm parsing it into an integer because I want to return. Am I? Let's see. Oh yeah, that's only because I want to index it. I'm returning a string. I'm parsing it into an integer because I want to be able to increment it. Because every time I call it, I want to increment it so that the next time I call it, I get the next sequence number, right? Because that's the whole point of this. Then I'm assigning the value, I'm stirring it, I'm converting it back to a string so that I can return it. Because most of the time we want this as a string because we're going to concatenate it onto some string in order to make the string unique. And then I'm setting the value back to the INI file, right? Because after I index it, I want to set it back. And then there's my return. So I'm returning the index to return. So let's see how it works now. So I've got a step called INI example. Let me find that. Here it is. And this is going to call my function get next sequence. And every time I run it, it's going to get the next sequence. So you see every time I run it, 14, 15, 16. And then of course what I would do is I would assign this to a string, and then I would, I would do this. I would say string my next, whoops. Again, that's because I kept running it and I don't have a GUI to run against my next sequence number equals get next sequence. Then I can take and concatenate this onto whatever value I want to put into my application. So, this might be, where you've got a name, a customer name, and you want to keep using the same customer name in your test data. You don't want to have to keep changing it. So you're just going to concatenate this number on it to make it unique. So that's one really quite easy way to do that. And, if anybody wants my version of get next sequence, just write to support and we'd be happy to send it to you. Now I'm going to show you kind of a variation of that, really. And we'll talk about dynamic test data. So in this case, instead of just a sequence number, what I want is a date time stamp so that I always know it's going to be unique. And so again, I chose to do this as a function. And here I call it return timestamp. So you see return timestamp. Here's my return code. It's a string. This is pretty easy, actually, because of this function right here. So you know that in AscentialTest, you can say now, and it will get you the actual time, the year, the month, the day, the hour, the minute, and the second. And so now gives me that. Now, if you're not familiar with this, this is again all drag and drop. You can come down here and you can drag over now. Just drag it and drop it and assign it to a variable of the type date time, because that's what it returns. It doesn't return a string, it returns a date time. But since I want a string, then I have to call format. And format allows me to decide what do I want that string to look like. And in this case, I want 4-year, month with a 0 leading, day with a 0 leading, hour, I think 0 leading, minutes and seconds. So that's how you format that. And then I'm going to return my string through the return code. Now I'll show you how I use that. So I have a step and I call it call return. So let's right here. And so here I've got a customer name. I might just call it automated test last name, and I print it, and you can see I've run this already. And then I want this to be unique. So I just concatenate onto the string return timestamp. And so if I run it, it does just that. And you can see every time I run it, I'm going to get something different, right? Because the minutes and the seconds are going to keep changing. So that's an easy way to make your data dynamic. And we've got just a little over 10 minutes left in the session. I usually try to end right at 10, so we're a couple minutes early. And I want to open it up now for questions.
Thank you, Brian. We already have 2 questions.
Sure.
The first one is, what is the scope of shared variables?
Good question. So the scope of a shared variable is the scope of the test. So the test can share with any of its steps, and the steps that are run from a test can share with each other. But the scope does not extend the test. Now, if we did that, then you would be able to pass parameters from test to test. And so in that case, the scope would be the scope of the plan or the plan instance in a suite. And that is exactly what we have in mind. So at some point, we may have something like that, some way to share between the tests, but we don't have that today. And since the scope of shared is only for the duration of the test, that's why we need those 2 data persistence examples that I showed you. So good question. And if there's any follow-up questions, by the way, when I answer, you can pose those to Sandra as well.
Thank you, Brian.
Sure.
In fact, Florence asked during the webcast if you can show again the first and second step, but sorry, I don't know exactly which.
Sure, yep. I think she means first and second step. I get it. Yeah. So let me do that. So let's go back to passing parameters. And so let's see, that will be first step and second step. So here's first step. And actually, let me clean up a little bit here. That'll make it easier. So we got first step, and then we've got second step, and then we're going to call it in shared test. So let me get that too. So I'll have all 3 of them here. Okay. So here's my test, and it's called, I've got my shared parameter test, and I've got first step, and I've got second step. And let's take a look at it. And this is key here. So thanks for bringing this up, Florence, because I wasn't really clear about this here, and I want to clarify that. In order for 2 steps or a test and its steps to share a parameter, the parameter must be the same name and the same type. This is what I failed to clarify when I first explained it. So it's shared, so you know you've got your types, you've got your in-out shared, so it's shared. You've got the name, test Visa Card 1, and you've got the type. Now if we go back and look at second step, we'll see exactly shared, test Visa Card 1, and the same type. It's only because I have shared the same name and type between first step and second step that I'm able to do this. So even though there's no parameter passing between these 2, if I run it again for you, you see that in a sense we've passed the parameter from first step to second step, but we haven't really passed it. Instead, we've got this buffer that we call a shared variable, and we're reading and writing from that buffer for the duration, which was the first question that was asked. What's the duration of that shared? It is the duration of this test. Notice it doesn't have to be declared inside the test. It can be if you want to share between a test and its step, but it doesn't need to be when it's just 2 steps that are sharing the variable. When I first saw this, it was not very intuitive to me. It took me a little while to understand what was going on here because there's nothing visual. You know, it's not like in and out where you see the input and the output and you can drag it and drop it. With shared, you don't see it because it's a buffer that's maintained at runtime between the steps. Any other
Thank you.
questions? Yeah, you're welcome. Other questions or follow-up questions? Okay, I think we're all set. So again, thank you all for attending today. I hope that you learned something new or got something reinforced for you. We do these once a quarter, usually the last month of the quarter. We haven't decided yet what the end of Q1 2021 is going to be. So if you have ideas about things that you would like, please put them forward. Just send a message to support@xenix.com, and we would be glad to put together a presentation on whatever subject you would like to learn more about. Thanks again.
Thank you, Brian. So just to answer the question, we will send the recording as well.
Thank you, Sandra. Yes, the recording will be available, and Sandra always makes it available soon after the presentation, so folks that signed up can always watch it, and we will post it on our YouTube channel as well. So it's a good reference to be able to refer back to. Thank you for reminding me, Sandra.
You're welcome. Thank you, Brian. Have a nice day. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.